Welcome to China in Context from the SOAS China Institute at the University of London. I'm Duncan Hewitt. China's one-child policy ended a decade ago, but its consequences are still being felt, not least in the continuing gender imbalance in the country's population. For several decades, the combination of restrictions on family size with traditional attitudes favouring male children, especially in rural areas, led to many female babies being aborted. China is currently estimated to have at least 30 million more men than women, and a new documentary film explores the impact this has had, particularly on young men from the countryside who can struggle to find a mate in China's increasingly competitive dating market. The film follows three young men who go on a week-long dating camp run by a self-styled dating coach, Mr. Howell, in an attempt to reinvent themselves and find love. It's made by Violet Du Feng, a Chinese filmmaker based in the US, who has previously worked in journalism with CNN and the BBC, and who in recent years has made a series of documentaries. These include Please Remember Me on the impact of Alzheimer's in China, and the Oscar shortlisted Hidden Letters, which focused on two young women trying to preserve Nüshu, an ancient secret written language used by women in Hunan province to communicate away from men's eyes. Her latest film, The Dating Game, has been showing widely at film festivals in the US and around the world. And this month it comes to the UK's Sheffield Documentary Festival, with TV and cinema distribution to follow. Well, Violet Feng, thank you very much for joining us. So in a lot of your previous work, you focused on the struggles of women in Chinese society. Why did you decide to make a film about men?
Well, look, I think that there's some obvious reasons and there's some hidden reasons leading me to making this film about men. When I was touring with Hidden Letters, a lot of people may have seen it actually premiered in the UK at BFI Film Festival in 2022. And as you said, it's a film about a secret ancient language created and shared only among women hundreds of years ago, and how the modern generation of women is trying to revive the language to cope with patriarchal society in China. As I was touring the film around the world, oftentimes there were questions from the audience jokingly asking that, is there any good men in China? Because obviously in that film, it's a very feminist look into the challenges of women are facing still in today's China.
Because one of the main characters is a woman who divorced her husband, and she's very committed to working to preserve this traditional women's language. And one of the other young women in the film basically breaks up with her fiancé on camera in the film, because he's basically telling her that he doesn't want her to carry on working to preserve this language. If they get married, he wants her to stay at home. So in a sense, the film very much shows that these young women trying to be themselves.
That's absolutely right. And also, I think the challenges that modern generation of women are facing in some sort of ways, even I find it surprising that my mom's generation already took a step forward, and then now it felt like there are things that's happening in the society that is making us take a step back in a lot of ways.
So in recent decades.
Yeah, and I think that the increased reproductive pressures, economic pressures, the workplace discriminations, and the political pressures, all of that combined is adding a lot more pressure for women that we didn't, my mom's generation didn't experience that before. But as I was touring that film, some audience was asking that whether there is any good men in China, and that was sort of like awakening moment for me to realize that it's kind of need to be falling on me to also showing a different side of the story. In particular, as the world, and especially in China, of how the gender divide has become so increasingly escalated, as you can see, on social media, and you can see anything related to gender that creates such a divide and sometimes even a social media crisis in China, made me realize that it's actually necessary and even more urgent to really understand men's perspective so we can create a dialogue. And I think that for me, I'm like Western trained and educated, and then work for foreign media before and work in China. And I think that it's comfortable to say that I'm a feminist myself, but I think that it is absolutely important to make films to also challenge my own stereotype and bias. And that's also really propelled me to try to understand from men's perspective of why they are also oftentimes feel frustrated.
And you mentioned that you were very much the only woman sort of in this whole project because your crew were men, and you filmed three men, and then the dating coach or the main coach for them, who's male, although his wife is in the film as well. But how did you choose this specific topic and these particular subjects?
Well, I've been making films about China for many years, and I think as the world become increasingly divided and polarized, I don't take it lightly for people outside of China now finding a reason to go to a cinema to watch a film about China. I think it's becoming increasingly more difficult. But I do think it's the responsibility of a filmmaker to find a draw for people to be able to willing to come to a cinema to watch a film about China for one reason, and hopefully they can walk away to find something different that they didn't expect. I think that following this dating camp provided such a unique and entertaining lens in many ways for people to be able to wanting to come to watch a film. But also, I think that it also provided a macro window for me to interrogate how politics, economy, culture, and technology all affected the way how we date. But more importantly, it's not about how we date, it's about how we connect with each other. So I think that's the core of something really unique and specific about China as a consequence of one child policy can open up a gigantic door for me to see something that's really universally resonating. And then the other side of it, as I was filming, I realized particularly, how technology affected how we connected with each other and the cost of what we have to bear to deceive on the internet in the digital world and the price we have to pay to be authentic and to be honest. And the wrestling between these two extreme ends is something that I think all of us can relate to.
You mentioned the one child policy. I mean, in a sense, these three young men who go to see the dating coach in Chongqing, this huge city, which used to be part of Sichuan, is now its own entity. They are really the victims, you could say, of the one child policy because of this great gender imbalance, which is decreasing a little, but I believe it's still around 110 male babies to 100 female. And for people in their 20s, the difference is more like 112 to 110 or even more. I think I've seen figures saying that there are 30 million more men in China than women. I don't know specifically for that age group, but clearly these young men who have also come from the countryside, as you show in the film, to get jobs like many migrant workers in the cities, they feel very left behind by particularly this very slick urban society, which is something else you portray. You have a lot of scenes on the streets of Chongqing and these young men trying to approach very smart, stylish young women in the street who often just completely ignore them. So, you chose these people who perhaps are the classic victims of this problem, because I guess maybe sort of urban, university-educated young men don't have quite so many problems in finding a partner.
Yeah, I mean, these people are absolutely, I mean, we're talking about 30 million surplus, but these are the men who are at the highest stake of not being able to find women. And that's also, I think you're universally relatable as, I live in New York of how the two groups of people who are on the surplus and left behind is woman who is highly achieving and then well educated and self-sufficient, and the working class men who are sort of punished by economic hierarchy and are also left behind. And then these two groups would never connect with each other. And I think that's only more extreme scenario in China.
So the women, in a sense, are the ones who many men would see as perhaps overeducated, and they don't want to get married young enough for some of these men. So the in China are sometimes known by this pretty unpleasant term, leftover women.
Leftover woman, the left behind man, I would say. But like these men, why they are not being able to, or impossible for them to find women, have so many societal reasons and contexts. For these men whose parents' generation are the backbone of Chinese economic boom, the migrant workers during a time of massive urbanization that happens in China. And their parents are basically the ones who built the new China, the modern China. But because of residency restrictions, their children were not able to travel with them because of educational, restriction policies.
The kids couldn't go with them to the cities, couldn't go to school in the
So they
cities.
were actually left behind in the villages, mostly raised by grandparents. So not only for these kids growing up without access to girls because of the one-child policy of how culturally we preferred, boys, and then a lot of times in these villages, the boys just completely outnumber the girls, hence that they don't know how to interact with girls, understandably, but also they didn't grow up with their parents. So they grew up without role model of relationship, but they also grew up lack of love. So they're desperate for love in a lot of ways. And that also translates a lot into why I think that they don't have confidence. They feel like they're invisible. They don't feel like they're worth being loved in a lot of ways, which is really, really heartbreaking. And then also their generation is being punished again because of these policies that they are still on the bottom of the society, not benefiting from the economic boom. And when China now is experiencing a really high number of unemployment rate, of course, they're the ones who are most likely and vulnerable not to have any jobs. And again, translate into why they don't have any competitive edge on the dating market as well. So I think that they're being almost triple punished. And then again, that all translated into the psychological traumas of these men, and also in a way explaining why they have no clue how women think and act and feel and everything.
The way you're describing it makes it sound incredibly heavy. I mean, in a sense, a lot of the film has a certain tragi-comic kind of feeling because you follow these men when they go to see this dating coach, who's this also a young guy who had originally come from a more rural background, called Mr. Howell. He's this classic urban, aspiring city slicker sort of person, and he takes them to buy new clothes and get new hairstyles. And sometimes it's ridiculous. At one point, one of the young men says to him, "Oh, I think in these clothes I look like a gangster." And he says, "Oh, you may call it gangster, but we call it fashion." And he also takes them to have photos taken for their dating profiles at a golf driving range, and they've never seen a golf club before. And he tells them, "Oh yeah, many women like guys who play golf. They think it's very attractive." So I mean, they're really fish out of water in this more sophisticated world. They're trying to perhaps attract educated young urban women, but it feels like they're quite doomed. I don't know how much you want to tell us about how things work out in the film, but you follow them through this whole week. So tell us a little bit about the process.
So film is very easy to digest and watch throughout. It's sort of like Hitch in real time. A fiction movie about Will Smith many years ago. Like, a complete makeover for men and how to catch women, and then, like pickup artists. And it's sort of like real version of that. But however, I think that the more that I'm into the film, I think that the humor comes in itself and the light tone of the film comes in itself. But the more that I was with them, the more I felt like there's a responsibility that comes with the humor that falls on my shoulder. Because the last thing I want is for people to laugh at these men.
You don't want to make fun of them.
Absolutely. But I think the humor is obviously necessary because it provided a fundamental baseline for us to connect with each other. And hopefully the audience laugh with us. But then I think that it's also my job to help people understand and contextualize the tragic reasons behind it of why this is very much their last resort, that they have to come to this absurd camp because they tried every other way and nothing works. And why is that? And I think it's so much to unpack in the film to make it a tragic comedy. I think that if it's just a comedy, then I failed the boys. We are going into something more complex and deeper.
And to do that, you follow them back to the places they left behind, right? These
Well, it's not necessarily that. I think that in the film, the majority of the film, that we have a very micro lens focusing on these boys, but there are also moments that we are zooming out into the bigger societal themes. For example, how the parents are all desperate across the country, going to parks in major cities every single weekend to matchmake on behalf of their grown children, behind their children's knowledge. And a lot of the parents on the market are, parents of boys. And again, that market in itself represent such a big gender imbalance. The girls are the ones who are highly educated and not able to find men who they want to be their equal. And then the boys are the ones who are more, working class and embarrassed, feeling that they've already failed their parents, and then so embarrassed and ashamed that not wanting to come into the matchmaking market. So it's already showing such a divide of these two groups.
And it also shows the fact that the parents remain so fixated on their children getting married. I mean, that has been very much a traditional value in China, although maybe some people are becoming a bit more relaxed about it. But there's that sort of generation gap that you also show how the young people are under so much pressure from the older generation.
It's a big cultural pressure, but also, in recent years, which has already translated into a response from the government also, like we also showed in a film of how government is desperate because of plummeting population in China, and how they are hosting matchmaking events all around the country. They're giving like multiple presents for people who are matched during those events, making statements like, getting married and having babies is a must experience for human beings that we all have to experience. And then also for young people, building a family is also an integral part to contribute to a harmonious society. So all of this shows the desperation of its plummeting, population, impacting China already on the economy.
And we hear a lot too, of course, about the aging population that resulted from the one-child policy. But even since the government relaxed the one-child policy over the last decade, the numbers of births has fallen quite significantly, hasn't it? So, and we hear a lot about women, younger women who don't want to get married or don't want to have children, and people feel there's so much pressure. It's so expensive to bring up a child, especially in a city.
Yeah, and we also, show in the film of how it's not just the economic reasons, but women, coming out from the past generations and now finally feeling that they don't have to be binded with marriages to fulfill the cultural expectations as a mother, as a wife, as daughter-in-laws, which is, these expectations hasn't changed. They just felt like, why bother? So we show in the film of how more than 10 million Chinese women are now hooked with AI dating apps to date AI boyfriends.
Prefer to have a virtual boyfriend.
Absolutely. And then the women that we talk to, they absolutely have no interest to date real men. They just find it so exhausting. And they also mentioned that, in real life, it's really hard to guess what the men are truly think. And then they're all playing these techniques and skills on them, which is what Hao is teaching these men.
The ones that they got from dating coaches.
Yes, and then the women are like, we're tired of these games. We would rather go with someone who's completely fake but perfect in every other way, because all these games are designed by women, and they're like, emotionally we feel fulfilled with the virtual man. We're okay.
Because in the film you do show where how the coach is basically trying to get them to lie on their dating profiles. He says to this guy who's very poor migrant worker, "Oh, tell them you own a house or an apartment." Like that's the only way to attract a woman.
And there's also a lot of techniques that he's teaching in terms of how to text them, like what kind of like verbal techniques they can use to attract women's attention. But also in the film, is another example of the macro lens that we're trying to, portray is, the consequence of when we have 30 million surplus of men. Historically, a lot of surplus of men often lead up to geopolitical instability and unrest. Like you can see in China of the bubbling of the nationalism fever, how that translated into so many men who are just like not happy with their lives. We recent years have seen a lot of random incidents of men seeking revenge over the societies by like stabbing people in the malls. And then inevitably most of these men are single men, a lot of times without jobs, around the age group between 30 to 50, and then they really have no hope. And In democratic countries, a lot of times they can showcase those angers against power, but in China they can't, right? So I think that's also another reason I felt when you cannot express those angers against power, it becomes a dynamic of escalating more divide between men and women because you can only show the anger against the other gender, right? So the gender divide fostered by these kind of incidents is really, really sensitive.
You actually said that some of the women who came to see your film Hidden Letters about the women's language were quite annoyed when they found out that you were planning to make a film about men next.
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually really surprised because there are some young women who will come to me and will say things like, "Do you really feel there's a need to create a dialogue with men these days?" And I was shocked. And I felt like that kind of narrative is even made it more important for me to and urgent for me to, making this film.
But in this film, in the dating game, you, as you say, you try very much to understand these three young men who are all quite different, different ages, different styles. But you get them to talk really quite sensitively, actually, and they have some really quite thoughtful comments, and they very much resist how the dating coaches attempts to get them to lie on their dating profiles, and several of them say, oh, I just need to be myself, you can't pretend. And they also, one of them talks, quite seriously about how he feels women have always had to suffer the most pressure in Chinese society, and he sort of understands why women are rebelling against that now. So, what did you feel about them and how they developed and how they responded to the dating techniques that were being kind of foisted on them?
It's very complex. I realized that following them throughout the dating game, at the beginning, I thought that they were coming out to find ways to find love. I think that's their end goal. But the more that I'm with them and how they interacted with Hao, even though they have pushbacks with Hao, but I think that at the end of the day, they came here to find themselves. Because to them, Hao was one of them. Hao understood deeply where they come from because he was one of them. But somehow he found a way to break through, becoming this dating coach. He became someone else that they long for. And I think that's their fascination about how and how he made it is something also draws them to into this camp. And they look up to him in some sort of ways. They want to make it to the other end and to find some sort of hope in their life. And I think that even though they pay so much money to come to see Hao's interest and investment in them is genuine. And that I can completely feel because he's from one of them and he knows he understands the deep pains that men have. And that differentiates him from the other dating coaches. There is that sense of genuineness and authenticity in him of wanting these men to have hope.
And he does, as the film develops, he sort of questions his own values and whether he's really helping these people. And you also filmed these very quite intimate scenes with his wife, who is actually a dating coach for women, I believe, and she's more urban and a bit more sophisticated than him, really, more educated, I guess. And she, at some point in the film, very much criticizes him. And I don't know how much you want to talk about what happens after that, but we suddenly see her saying that, I used to think that you were a sincere, honest person, and now you're so obsessed with these techniques for kind of fooling women into relationships. I feel like you've been poisoned, and I don't kind of respect you really in the same way. So you get these very intimate moments on camera, as you did with the character in Hidden Letters, who basically breaks up with her fiance. I don't know how you do that, but what can you tell us about where that sort of ends up?
Well, I think that, the fact that housewife is also a dating coach, but also only coaches women is a fascinating layer for me to explore. And then that was also one of the reasons that I chose how to kind of debate of how their approaches are different or similar. And I was really curious about that. But at the end of the day, what it really, I think it's important to me is to understand each other with empathy. It's sort of like how I process the world right now. And then there's so many hatred, there's so many anger, there's so many frustrations. But I felt like what's behind that is fear, right? I mean, the fear is what propels division. The fear is propels isolation. If we don't have any empathy and curiosity, there's no way that we will have a way to understand the other who we think that's different from us.
And yeah, I think you were saying that actually the couple, Hao and Wen, who are the husband and wife dating coaches, they sort of come to understand each other more through these disagreements that you capture on film.
That's the beauty of camera, and that's the beauty of making films. And I think that, that lens, that camera lens in itself facilitated conversation on and behind camera.
So it actually helped the couple to sort of express their feelings.
It did. I think that, the huge argument that the two of them had was on day one of production before the start of the dating camp. And I was completely blown away of how this happened. But I also think that both of them trusted that I have, I'm not picking sides on either one of them, but in a way that I'm here to understand both, that they come from different worlds. So coming out from that perspective allows them to have this conversation that they weren't even able to have before. And I think because of that and because of the journey that we spent with them, how was able to realize that if he is not questioning himself of the surface that he's projecting as a really confident dating coach using all these techniques to lure women, which to his credit, he does have like hundreds of couples, successful rate of those people getting married with his help. He could get women to come out for a date within a day, with the techniques that he's using, texting these women on behalf of his clients. And I'm seeing that again and again, proven. And then the women are buying into it and like, okay, so okay, what's happening there? But throughout this process, Hao is also wrestling how much of that is why he got his wife, and then how much of that is in disconnection with who he really is as a person and how he should really project himself in a more authentic way to communicate with his wife, which is something that his wife is so frustrated with. All of this, and like it's really also reminded me of like how much of us is projecting ourselves on social media, how we're all projecting a different identity. And I think we're at a crossroad for the world because of technology, because of social media, because of all of that. We're at a crossroad of reimagining what is the basic ingredients for us to connect with each other as human beings. And I hope that, this film can help provide some sort of like tools for us to question ourselves, interrogating what should be the new ingredients or basic ingredients for us to connect with each other.
Did the experience of making this film in any way change your perspective about the status of or the position of women in China, where they stand in Chinese society? Because in some ways in this film that women are presented as having a fair amount of power, certainly, relative to these kind of young guys who are really struggling to, even get a date ever. Whereas in your previous films, obviously, it's been a lot about how women have been badly treated over history.
I wouldn't say change my attitude towards women, but I do see, from the release of Hidden Letters to this film, what concerns me is the indifference and then sometimes the anger that we hold towards each other. And that's really alarming and concerning.
Is that something that you're sort of seeing specifically in China, or is that just a more general thing you're talking about?
I think it's more general, the hostility that we have, even in the US against the transgender community and LGBTQ in general, But I think that making this film for me takes quite an exercise to practice the level of empathy and not to jump on any, conclusion or judgment that I have, because I think that it's really easy not only to laugh at the man in the film, but also to laugh at Hao, who project himself as a successful dating coach using all these techniques, acting as the expert of someone who completely understands women, but who actually are clueless in a lot of ways. But like how do I avoid that, but take a step further of myself to just ask more about but why? But why? What's behind that? That I think take efforts, that I think take curiosity, take empathy, and that's my own way of contributing to the concerns that I have of how easily people can just, be hostile with each other, particularly in China with the gender divide.
And I don't know how easy you found it to make films in China at the moment, but do you have plans to carry on trying to document social issues in China, or do you have other plans to move further afield in the future?
I don't have an answer to that question, honestly. I have been making films about China for 20 years. And I think the drive for me to make films in China, it's always been that, I don't want it to make films about China just for foreign audience. It's really important to me to make films for my own people as well, because I firmly believe that change should happen from within. And that is also why you rarely find in my film that it's really sort of like scapegoating the government for, like it's very easy to make any films that's finger point at the government for anything that went wrong. It's because of their fault. But I think that it's really important to bring complex point of view that even can resonate with people on the grassroots level in China. One of my previous films, Please Remember Me, about Alzheimer care in China.
About an elderly couple.
Yeah, and that was told through a love story. And the reason that we chose the film through the lens of telling a story of a love story is that that's a way that it can be seen in China, and for people to understand from a humanized perspective about Alzheimer patients, which is largely discriminated against in our society. But by making that film and create a 3 years robust impact campaign, we created policy changes, not only, celebrated by the audience there, but also embraced by, the administration to change policies. And that I believe there's a way to do that. And that's become my cinematic language to negotiate, to be nuanced and layered and provide a complexity and subtlety for people to see the issues behind it and finding a way to emotionally engage people, to think about what we can all contribute to social change. And that was my ethos of making films for so many years about China and for China. But there's also a balance, for any filmmakers who make films about China, that we juggle the consequence.
Especially if you want to get your films shown in China. I mean, Hidden Letters was shown in the cinema. I believe you had to make a few cuts, but I don't know whether The Dating Game will be shown.
The balance as a filmmaker that we have to juggle is the consequence that the protagonists in the film and the crew and the filmmaker, we all have to face, particularly the protagonist. And how do we all take in that into consideration and then protect the people that we need to protect? And also taking into the consideration of the impact that the film could realistically have on the audience. It's a lot to digest and it's a lot to juggle. And honestly, I don't know for this film whether, the impact will outweigh the consequence of what these men will face when it's released in China. I think that these men, obviously, they're on the bottom of the society. They're already seen as failures by the larger society. And I think they can be easily attacked on the internet, either by women or by the society. And also, like, I don't want Hao to be seen as a bad person, too. He has a lot of controversy in his personality and all that. But, things happen for reason that we explained. But people are so easy in jumping on conclusions and judgments on social media and internet, particularly about gender issues in China, as I said, how sensitive it is. So I think that it could also easily he could be attacked as well. So I mean, these are responsibilities that's sitting on my shoulder.
So does that mean that you're actually thinking yourself whether or not to release it?
Absolutely. And even like whether or not to continue making films about China yet today. Not saying that I won't in the future, but whether we should take a pause. If I decided that I choose not to have my film released in China, then there's no reason for me to make a film about China anymore, which is very sad. If it come to the end that even filmmakers who have been dedicated ourselves to this cause for so many years, wanting to finding a way to bridge, wanting to find a way to show the film both in China and out of China is coming to this place. We won't have any independent voices left in China to make films.
Well, Violet Feng, we wish you very good luck in your future projects, wherever they take you. And thank you so much for talking to us on China in Context.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, that's all we have time for on this episode. You can find information about SOAS China Institute events and read our blog on our website, soas.ac.uk. For now, thanks for listening and goodbye.